I'm going to talk about consciousness. Is your brain really a computer, or is it a quantum orchestra tuned to the universe? What do I mean by that? Well, there are two basic approaches. We actually heard that in the panel. Neuroscience, cognitive science, AI say the brain is a computer. Consciousness emerges from complex computation among neurons. On the other hand, panpsychists, naturalists, Eastern philosophers, Whitehead proponents, Penrose objective reduction says the brain tunes into consciousness intrinsic to the universe. And there's a way of connecting these and making them both be at least partially true through quantum physics and non-locality. And this is a theory I've worked on with Sir Roger Penrose for 24 or 5 years through quantum processes and structures in microtubules inside neurons. So a brief data slide here. The idea that the brain is a computer is based on the Hodgkin-Huxley neuron, developed in the 50s, which found that in a neuron, dendrites and cell body receive inputs, integrate them to a firing threshold, and then fire as a digital bit to the next neuron or the next layer. That's the basic idea. And you can see that what this would be predicted is that you have the integration and the firing in a very narrow threshold and a slope. So narrow threshold, narrow firing. However, that's not the case if you measure from a neuron in a awake animal or presumably human. What you have is a very broad threshold and vertical. And this means that there's something else going on in the neuron determining firing. And if you think of firing as your behavior, moving your arm, saying particular words, you're integrating inputs and deciding what to do. And some non-computable factor regulates firing and spiking. And this was found in this study shown here in Nature. And this is where consciousness could regulate behavior by modulating our normally reflexive activities. And being is meant to imply consciousness, and there's a big temporal variability and a wide threshold. So something else is influencing our behaviors other than neuronal membrane activity. Could it be from a deeper layer? So here we have a neuron, and here's a dendrite, here's a synapse coming in, here's the axon hillock, and firing goes this way. And inside we see these structures called microtubules that I and others have been obsessed with for many years. And the question is, where's the being? Where does consciousness occur? Is it in the cytoskeleton, or is it in the synapse and the membrane, as most people would say? So if we look inside, we see these microtubules, or we see one in this case, and here materials made in the cell body have to be transported. Here's a neuron down here, have to be transported down to a particular synapse, and the microtubules act as a railroad track for these motor proteins. They actually look like this. I'm not making this up. They actually look like this, and they drop their cargo off at a particular synapse. So if you have a synapse here, the motor proteins have to jump from microtubule and microtubule, and then know to go right or left at the branch. And how do they do that? It turns out that this protein called tau, which you may have heard of in Alzheimer's disease, because in Alzheimer's disease, the microtubules fall apart and the tau falls apart, is like a postal code. It tells the motor proteins where to get off. So the location of the tau on the microtubule is a memory code. This is where memory is. It can't be at the synapses for reasons that I can go into later if somebody asks me. But it seems to be encoded in the microtubules. So this is consistent with the idea of microtubules processing information. And here's their structure. They're made of these peanut-shaped proteins called tubulin, and they can process information like computers or cellular automata, actually. And I got interested in microtubules back in the 70s when I was in medical school in a cancer lab, and wrote a bunch of papers in the 80s and 90s about information processing in microtubules, and then later with Roger Penrose about quantum computing in microtubules. So the singularity guy, is Rob still here? Anyway, what they say is that to have brain equivalents, to have neuronal synaptic computation, artificial intelligence, singularity, they say there's 10 to the 11th neurons in the brain, 100 billion. Each has about 1,000 synapses. They operate at about 100 hertz. This gives 10 to the 16th operations per second per brain. So if we get a computer that can do that, it will have brain equivalents and be conscious. They've already kind of reached it, and nothing's conscious yet. Well, one reason may be that if you go to the level of the microtubules, you have the same 10 to the 11th neurons, about 1 billion tubulins per neuron, switching at about 10 million times a second. And this is 10 to the 16th operations per second per neuron. So the same amount in one neuron as they say in the whole brain, or 10 to the 27th operations per brain. So, does that explain it? No, it doesn't explain it at all. It's just more computation, it's more processing. Where's the Bing? Is something else required? Somebody back in the early 90s suggested I read a book by Roger Penrose called The Emperor's New Mind, which I did, and it was arguing against the brain being a computer. Roger used something called Gödel's theorem to show that conscious understanding is non-computational, that something outside the computational system is required, and that something is most likely to be involved with quantum state reduction, collapse of the wave function. This gets into quantum physics. We'll come back to this in a second. And the measurement problem in quantum mechanics. And that this factor was a factor related to the underlying structure of the universe, what the universe is actually made of, way below the level of atoms and quarks and things like that. And this is the non-computable influence, which could also bring in consciousness. So this forces us to deal with quantum mechanics, and nobody really understands quantum mechanics even today. Basically, the world in which we live is divided into two realms, governed by two separate laws, the laws of quantum and the laws of classical. Now, these different laws in the classical world, down below, everything's localized in one place, and things are particle-like, and fairly large, although the large-small cutoff is variable. And in the quantum world, at very small levels, things can be in quantum superposition, which means they can be in multiple locations or states at the same time. This pointer can be here and here, if it was really small, at the same time. And this is a bizarre thing, but it's been shown many, many times. Things can be connected over distance. So you make a measurement here, something over here happens instantaneously, faster than light. Which befuddled Einstein. And things can be wave-like and small. So we have this dichotomy of different sets of laws at the large and the small, and the boundary between them is called collapse of the wave function. So first of all, how do you account for the fact, or how do you even grok the fact that something could be in two places at once? The only explanation for that I've ever heard comes from Roger Penrose, shown here, where he took quantum mechanics and married it to general relativity, which is a big conceptual gap. And in general relativity, as Einstein said, for big things, matter is equivalent to curvature in space-time geometry. So Einstein predicted, for example, that the light from a star behind the sun would be bent by the sun and would be visible if you could see it, for example, during a total eclipse, which Eddington did and proved him right, and that showed that space-time is curved and that matter is equivalent to curvature. Well, that's for something very large. Roger applied that to small things and said that a particle, for example, this little particle here, is a curvature in space-time. So he, instead of having four-dimensional space-time, he used these two-dimensional space-time sheets, which is actually very clever, and a particle here is a curve here, and if it moves over here, it's over there. The curvature changes. So a particle oscillating between two locations would be the equivalent to the space-time curvature oscillating back and forth between the two. And then superposition, being in multiple locations at the same time, you'd have a separation, or two curvatures, which would separate, and the particles would be in both locations at the same time. Now, and so this could be a quantum bit or a qubit as used in quantum computing, where you have the two possibilities and then both possibilities coexisting. Now, if you're familiar with the multiple worlds hypothesis, some people think that there is no collapse, that each possibility branches off and forms its own universe, and this would be a separation in the structure of the universe, and each particle would essentially evolve its own universe. Despite how bizarre and crazy this sounds, it's a very, very popular idea. In fact, I think a poll of physicists favored this by a plurality at least. The multiple worlds hypothesis gets rid of consciousness, it gets rid of a lot of problems, but it just doesn't make any sense, and there's no way to test it or prove it. Now, why don't we see superpositions in our real world? In the early days of quantum mechanics, quantum pioneers thought that measurement or conscious observation caused collapse of the wave function. Here's Bing and this conscious observer. He or she is looking at this space-time sheet, and this one ceases to exist and this one continues. So he has caused collapse of the wave function, or what I call subjective reduction. This is also known as the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, and Niels Bohr, von Neumann, Wigner, and modern proponents like Henry Stapp, David Chalmers, and others still maintain that this is true. Now, this is dualist. It puts consciousness outside of science. It's some weird thing that causes collapse of the wave function, but we can't really explain what it is. Now, Roger turned it around. He said that these superpositions would be unstable, and after a time t, given by this very simple equation, h over e sub g, where e sub g is the amount of superposition, would collapse, and one would cease to exist, the other would continue, and there would be a moment of consciousness. So Roger said this collapse occurs spontaneously due to a process in the fundamental level of the universe, producing a moment of conscious experience, being. Now, in other words, what he's saying is rather than consciousness causing collapse by objective reduction causes or is consciousness. This was and remains the only theoretical mechanism to produce consciousness ever proposed, other than emergence and hand waving and claiming it doesn't exist, and that people sometimes do. It's the only scientific mechanism producing consciousness that's ever been put forth. So here it is again, being in the structure of space-time geometry, and to compare it to the consciousness causing collapse, in this case, collapse causes consciousness and generates consciousness. So this would be happening in the environment, in the wall, in the tables, everywhere around us, kind of like panpsychism. But they would be proto-conscious. They would these little moments of conscious experience would lack meaning. They would lack memory. They would just be there and then be gone, and nobody would know any difference. They would be proto-conscious, similar to what Whitehead called simple occasions of experience. And I liken them to, if you go to the symphony and the orchestra is warming up and each musician is tuning his or her instrument, and you hear these noises and tones and sounds, it's a cacophony. It's not really music, it's noise. So that's occurring, that's like the proto-conscious moments occurring in the world around us. How do they become organized or orchestrated to produce full, rich conscious moments such as we experience in the brain for full, rich conscious experience? And I do think the musical analogy or metaphor is appropriate here. So how could they? Roger needed a quantum computer in the brain which could biologically orchestrate quantum information, halt or terminate by his mechanism, connecting to space-time geometry, including platonic values and qualia, giving awareness and feelings, and regulate neuronal and synaptic activities. In his book, The Emperor's New Mind, he admitted he didn't really know. Neuronal firings and not firings were too large. I read his book and I thought, wow, microtubules might be exactly what he is looking for. And I wrote to him, and he was curious enough that he invited me to Oxford. And I invited him to the first Tucson conference that Mauricio mentioned. Here we are at the Grand Canyon. There's Roger, Dave Chalmers, myself back there, and we started this theory, orchestrated objective reduction. Here we are a few years ago. He's being mobbed, and basically, to cut to the chase, the idea is this: here's a neuron, and most people in neuroscience would say neuronal firings are the fundamental bits of information processing. But we go deeper inside to the microtubule, into these quantum dipole oscillations that I'll talk about in a minute, and eventually down to space-time geometry, the space-time sheets. And this goes over time scale up into the hertz, which is where EEG occurs, and then down into microtubules in the kilohertz, megahertz, gigahertz, and terahertz. And this is where anesthesia acts. Anesthesia acts in the terahertz range. So basically, we have a quantum bit or qubit of space-time geometry and a quantum bit in tubulin that are equated over different scales. And there is evidence for this from Anirban Bandyapade showing these triplets of excitation in terahertz, gigahertz, megahertz, kilohertz, and hertz at the level of neurons, individual microtubules, and tubulins. So there's evidence for these oscillations. How do we prove it? I think the best way to prove the biological origin of consciousness is through anesthesia. I'm an anesthesiologist. I've been studying how anesthesia works for a long time. In the 19th century, a group of anesthetic gases were discovered which, when inhaled, caused euphoria at low concentrations, and at higher concentrations rendered animals and humans unconscious and unresponsive. So here's laughing gas, nitrous oxide, living made easy. People are quite happy breathing this laughing gas. We still use laughing gas in the OR. Ether frolics, we don't use ether anymore. It's explosive, but people sniffed small amounts of ether and got high on it. But if you take enough of ether or anything, you become anesthetized, unresponsive. And this is the first surgical procedure by Morton done on a patient at the Mass General in 1846, breathing ether. And it's been a big part of medicine. Imagine needing surgery and without anesthesia. So the anesthetic gases are all different, but they have these nonpolar oil-like regions that are part of them. And despite being chemically different, they're soluble in the same medium. And Meyer and Overton found that their solubility in olive oil, of all things, was linearly proportional over many orders of magnitude to their potency. Minimal alveolar, this is the MAC, the higher the MAC, the less potent, you need more of it. So the most potent is methoxyfluorine, not methamphetamine, methoxyfluorine, and it's the most soluble in olive oil. There are two gases which are outliers. They are soluble in olive oil, but they don't cause anesthesia, TFMB and F6. Olive oil is based on organic chemistry. It's benzene-like rings with these pi resonance electron clouds that hover above and below the molecule, and they support quantum effects. And many people think that life and consciousness derive from pi resonance in these organic biomolecules. And if you take two of them, they attract each other because the electrons in one form a dipole which repels the other, and they form these sort of like bar magnets, and they attract each other, and this is how things bind inside membranes and proteins, and then they oscillate in terahertz. So they oscillate back and forth at 10 to the 12th per second, and they can also be in quantum superposition. Now, the psychedelics, which we just heard about, all have these pi resonance groups. Here are dopamine and serotonin, which are normal neurotransmitters, and LSD and DMT and psilocybin that we just heard about also have extensive pi resonance rings. And I would argue that they actually promote quantum states inside the brain. And there are other areas of the brain, and lipids and nucleic acids, that have these pi resonance groups. There's a quantum underground inside our brains. So after decades of assumption that anesthetics act on membrane proteins, the evidence now points to anesthetic action on microtubules for reasons that I don't have time to go into. In this paper in Scientific Reports, we looked inside tubulin. You see it has all these pi resonance groups, and there's where the anesthetic's bound. And we simulated quantum dipole couplings among all 86 of these pi resonance clouds and found a spectrum of activity with a collective dipole oscillation at 613 terahertz, which is in the blue light region of the spectrum. We then added anesthetics, and the presence of anesthetics abolished, and non-anesthetics did not abolish the 613 terahertz peak. This is blue light deep in the brain, which correlates with consciousness, normally staying internal to the system. However, we know that Hindu deities often are portrayed as blue, so maybe in extraordinary circumstances it comes out. So back to our theory here, the idea that anesthesia acts here, and normally this would cascade upward to slower things or downward to faster things in the structure of space-time geometry. And why don't the non-anesthetics cause anesthesia? It turns out that they're more polarizable, and we think they kind of go along for the ride with the dipole oscillations, whereas anesthetics dampen them. So basically the idea is that something happens in microtubules, there's a collapse of the wave function, and this corresponds at a much deeper, smaller level with a phenomenon going on in space-time geometry. So consciousness would be a sequence of these collapses, bing, 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 bing. And the qualia, the redness of the rose, would be due to not a particular pattern of activity in her brain, but rather a particular pattern of fundamental space-time geometry intrinsic to the rose and also intrinsic to her brain. And what is space-time geometry? It's smaller. We don't really know. I'm using this particular curvature. There are many approaches to it. It's been described since the time of the ancient Greeks that we're living in, we're part of some matrix rather than being particles moving through a void. These are all particular attempts to describe it. Does it contain information? Does it contain phenomenal experience? Can it influence biology? We think the answer is yes. The structure of space-time may be holographic, self-similar at different scales. So imagine we're up here going smaller and smaller and smaller down to the Planck scale where we get all this information. And consciousness, Bing, could go down and be more intense as we go deeper into the structure of the universe and possibly exist without biology. And it's interesting that if you look at the scale of the universe from the very tiny, the Planck, to the largest, the size of the universe, that on a log scale, our brains are about in the middle. So there could be leverage going in either direction. So let me conclude by saying that, number one, consciousness is a process in the fine scale structure of the universe, connected to the brain by quantum processes and microtubules. Anesthesia selectively prevents consciousness by dampening these quantum terahertz vibrations in microtubules inside brain neurons. The microtubules would normally regulate neuronal activities. And finally, medical advances in treating mental and cognitive disorders and other diseases will point and utilize quantum vibrations in microtubules, and that might include psychedelics, which I think which affect microtubules either indirectly through metabotropic serotonin receptors or directly. DMT is produced endogenously and can get inside the cell, and we would predict, and there's studies now that show that psychedelics affect neuronal growth in cell culture by promoting microtubule activity. So I think there'll be a paradigm shift in medicine looking more at quantum vibrations in microtubules to treat mental and cognitive disorders. Thank you very much.